Book 3, Chapter 50, The Death of Viduratha. Vasishtha said, as the tide of war was rolling violently with a general massacre on both sides, the intelligent monarchs thought on the means of saving their own forces from the impending ruin. The magnanimous king of Sindhu, who was armed with patience, called to his mind the Vaishnava weapon, which is the greatest of arms, and as powerful as Shiva himself. He hurled the Vaishnava weapon using his best judgment mantra. Immediately it emitted 1,000 sparks of fire from its flaming blade on all sides. These sparks became balls as big and bright as to shine like hundreds of suns in the sky, and others flew like lengthy shafts of cudgels in the air. Some of them filled the sky, wide field of the sky, with thunderbolts, as thick as the blades of grass, and others spread over the lake of heavens with battle axes like a bed of lotuses. These poured forth showers of pointed arrows, spreading like a net in the sky, and fired dark sword blades scattered like tree leaves in the air. At this time, the rival king, Viduratha, set forth another Vaishnava weapon for repelling the former and removing the reliance of his foe in his weakness. It sent forth a stream of weapons counteracting those of the other, and overflowing in currents of arrows and pikes, clubs and axes, missiles of various kinds. These weapons struggled with and jostled against each other. They split the vault of heaven with their clattering, and cracked like loud thunderclaps, leaving mountain cliffs. The arrows pierced rods and swords, and the swords hewed down axes and lances to pieces. The mauls and mallets drove the missiles, and the pikes broke the spears. The mallets, like Mandara rocks, broke and drove away the rushing arrows as waves of the sea, and the restless swords broke to pieces by striking at the maces. The lances revolved like the halo of the moon, repelling the black sword blades as darkness, and the swift missiles flashed as the destructive fires of Yama. The whirling discs were destroying all other weapons. They stunned the world by their noise and broke mountains by their strokes. The clashing weapons were breaking one another in numbers, and Viduratha defeated the arms of Sindhu, like a steadfast mountain defies the thunders of Indra. The truncheons were blowing away the curved swords, and the pikes were warding off the stones fired by slings. The crowbars broke down the pointed heads of the pikes. The iron rods of the enemy were broken by tridents of Shiva, and the enemy arms were falling down and crushing one another to pieces. The clattering shots stopped the course of the heavenly stream, and the combustion of powder filled the air with smoke. The clashing of dashing weapons lit the sky like lightning. Their clattering cracked the world like thundercaps, and their shock split and broke the mountains like thunderbolts. Thus the warring weapons were breaking one another by their impacts and protracting the engagement by their mutual overthrow. As Sindhu was standing still in defiance of the prowess of his adversary, Viduratha lifted his own firearm and fired it with a thundering sound. It set Sindhu's war chariot on fire, like a heap of hay on the plain, while the Vaishnava weapons filled the ethereal sphere with their meteoric blaze. The two kings were thus engaged in fierce fighting with each other, the one firing his weapons like drops of raging rain, and the other hurling his arms like currents of a deluging river. The two kings were thus harassing each other like two brave champions in their contest, when the chariot of Sindhu was reduced to ashes by its flame. He then fled to the woods like a lion from its cavern in the mountain, and repelled the fire that pursued him by his aqueous weapons. After losing his car and alighting on the ground, he brandished his sword and cut off the hooves and heels of the horses of his enemy's chariot in the twinkling of an eye. He hacked everything that came before him, like the lean stalks of lotuses. Then Viduratha also left his chariot with his sword in hand. Both were equally brave and matched to one another in their skill in warfare. They turned about in their rounds and scraped their swords into saws by striking against the other. With their jagged weapons, they tore the bodies of their enemies like fish, crushed under teeth. When Viduratha dropped down his broken sword and threw his javelin against his enemy, it fell with a rattling noise on the bosom of Sindhu, like a flaming meteor falls rumbling in the breast of the sea. But the weapon fell back, having hit his breastplate. Like a maiden flies back from the embrace of a lover, deemed an unfit match for her. Its shock made Sindhu throw out a flood of blood from his lungs, resembling the water spout an elephant lets out from its trunk. Seeing this, the second Leela cried with joy to her sister Leela. See, here the demon Sindhu, killed by your lion-like husband. Sindhu is slain by the javelin of our lion-like Lord, like the wicked demon by the nails of the lion god Narasimha. And he is spouting forth his blood like the stream of water thrown out by the trunk of an elephant from a pool. But alas, this Sindhu is trying to mount on another car. Although bleeding so profusely from his mouth and nostrils as to raise a wheezing sound. Look here, our Lord Viduratha is breaking down the golden mountings of his car with the blows of his mallet, like the thundering clouds. Pushkara and Avarta break down the gold peaks of Sumera. See this Sindhu now moaning on another carriage, which is now brought before him and decorated like the splendid seat of a Gandharva. Alas, our Lord has now made the mark of Sindhu's mallet, hurled like a thunderbolt against him, but lo, he flies off and avoids the deadly blow of Sindhu. Hurrah! How nimbly he has got up upon his own car. But sorrow is to me that Sindhu has overtaken him in his flight. He mounts on his car like a hunter, climbs on a tree, and pierces my husband like a bird catcher with his pointed arrow. Does a parrot hidden in its hollow. Behold, his car is broken down, and its flags flung aside. The horses are hurt, and the driver is driven away. His bow is broken, and his armor is shattered, and his whole body is full of wounds. His strong breastplate is broken by slabs of stone, and his big head is pierced by pointed arrows. Behold him thrown down on earth, all mangled in blood. Look with what difficulty he is restored to his senses. And seated in his seat with his arm cut off and bleeding under Sindhu's sword. See him weltering in blood, gushing out profusely from his body like a red stream, issuing from a hill of rubies. Sorrow with me, and cursed be the sword of Sindhu that has brought this misery on us. It has severed his thighs like they cut a tree with a saw, and it has lopped off his legs like the stalks of trees. Ah, it is I who am struck and wounded and killed by the enemy. I am dead and gone and burnt away with my husband's body. Saying so, the second Leela began to shudder with fear at the sorrowful sight of her husband and fell unconscious on the ground like a vine cut off by an axe. Viduratha, though thus mutilated and disabled, was rising to smite the enemy in his rage when he fell down from his car like an uprooted tree and was replaced there by his charioteer, ready to make his retreat. At that instant, the tribal Sindhu struck a saber on his neck and pursued the car in which the dying monarch was borne back to his tent. The body of Padma, alias Viduratha, was placed like a lotus in the presence of Saraswati, shining with the splendor of the sun. But the elated Sindhu was kept from entering that place, like a giddy fly from a flame. The enemy returned to his camp, and the charioteer entered the apartment and placed the body on its deathbed in the presence of the goddess. The body was all mangled and besmeared with blood, seeping from the pores of the severed neck. Chapter 51, Sindhu's Rule. Vasishtha said, the loud cry that the king was killed in battle by the rival monarch struck the people with awe and filled the realm with dismay. Carts loaded with utensils and household articles were driving through the streets. Women with their loud wailing were running away amidst the impassable paths of the city. Weeping maidens fleeing for fear were ravished on the way by their captors. Inhabitants were in danger of being plundered of their properties by one another. The joyful shouts of soldiers in the enemy camp resounded with the roaring of loose elephants and neighing of horses, trampling men to death on their way. The doors of the royal treasury were broken open by brave brigands. The hinges flew off the ceiling, re-echoed to the strokes. The warders were overpowered by numbers, and countless treasures were plundered and carried away. Bandits ripped off the bellies of the royal dames in the palace, and the Chandala freebooters hunted down the royal apartments. The hungry rabble robbed provisions from the royal stores, and soldiers were snatching jewels from weeping children trodden down under their feet. Young and beautiful maidens were dragged by their hair from the seraglio, and rich gems that fell from their hands of the robbers glistened all the way. Chiefs assembled with ardor, with their troops of horses, elephants, and war chariots, and announced the installation of Sindhu by his minister. Chief engineers were employed in decorating the city and its halls, and the balconies were filled by the royal party attending the inauguration. It was then that the coronation of Sindhu's son took place, amidst the loud acclamations of victory. Titles and dignities were conferred upon the noblemen on the victor's side. The royal party were fleeing for their lives into the villages where they were pursued by the victorious soldiers. A general pillage spread in every town and village throughout the realm. Gangs of robbers thronged about and blocked the passages for pillage and plunder. A thick mist darkened the light of day for want of the magnanimous Viduratha. The loud lamentations of the friends of the dead and the bitter cries of the dying, mixed with the clamor raised by the driving cars, elephants, and horses, thickened the air like a solid sound body of sound. Loud trumpets proclaimed the victory of Sindhu in every city and announced his sole sovereignty all over the earth. The high-shouldered Sindhu entered the capital like a second Manu, or repopulating it after the all-devastating flood of war was over. Then the tribute of the country poured into the city of Sindhu from all sides. These, loaded on horses and elephants, resembled the rich cargoes borne by ships to the sea. The new king issued forthwith his circulars and royal edicts to all sides, struck coins in his own name, and placed his ministers as commissioners in all provinces. His iron rod was felt in all districts and cities, like the inflexible rod of Yama, and it awed the living with fear of instant death. All insurrections and tumults in the realm soon subsided. To rest under his reign like the flying dust of the earth and the falling leaves of trees fall to the ground upon subsistence of a tempest. The whole country, on all sides, was pacified to rest, like the perturbed sea of milk, after it had been churned by Mandara mountain. Then there blew the gentle breeze of Malaya, unfurling the locks of the lotus-faced maidens of Sindhu's realm, and blowing the liquid fragrance of their bodies around, and driving away the unwholesome air of the Karni. The editor, V.L. Mitra, comments, the entire vision of Leela shows the state of human life, with its various incidents and phases to its last termination by death. The discontented Brahman longs for royal dignity imagines all its enjoyments in the person of Padma, and at last, in the character of Viduratha, sees all its evils. The lesson is for aspirants to avoid aiming at high worldly honors, which end in their destruction. In her silent meditation, Leela, by her wisdom, sees the whole course and vicissitudes of the world and the rise and fall of human glory in the aspirations of her husband. You know, if we've had our Jyotish chakra calculated, we become aware of two lists of karmic traces. The first list, with green check marks, is called the positive karmic traces, and the last list is called the negative karmic traces with red X's. This is further evidence of what we have done in the past to become more and more embroiled in the samsara. As we aspire for high worldly honors, in the past we generate the so-called positive karmic traces. And as we tear down the universe, destroying it in every turn, and the people that live there, we create the negative karmic traces. But the distinction between positive and negative is a misnomer. There is no such thing as a positive karmic trace, is there? Why are they sorted in this way? It's done to enlist the support of the ego. The ego is the collection of our individual karmic traces. It's truly an illusory thing, but it's in charge of the illusory life that people are living in the material world. If we ever wish to escape from this illusion, we need the cooperation of the ego. Because the ego can take charge of the mind and does. It can take charge of our only ability to think a thought, and it does. The ego wants to think all kinds of thoughts that will only generate more karmic traces. So we need to convince the ego, number one, that the goal of human existence is moksha, jivan mukti, enlightenment while still embodied in the physical realm. Now the ego has enough common sense in most people to be reasoned with. Who's doing the reasoning? The ego is reasoning with himself, isn't he? The past actions of convincing the ego that the goal of life is enlightenment, are also recorded in the karmic traces as a momentum. And we can use that momentum to further our objective of achieving the cooperation of the ego so that we can perform sadhana, spiritual techniques for balancing karmic traces. But ultimately, who is moving us in this direction of enlightenment? It's not the ego, is it? It is the light of the silent witness. Because even though we may not have been connected with the silent witness and taken the role as the silent witness in our lives, it is not without its influence. Always the silent witness is there, the deeper levels of mind, as a reservoir of peace and calm, tranquility, an inviting fountain of bliss. So we have this sense of it there always. But I think you can see how amazing it is that after all these eons of incarnations in 4 million life forms, that somehow we have turned the trend toward greater and greater engagement with the samsara to extricating ourselves from this engagement. Fortunately, in this lifetime, as a member of Sahasrara Sirsha Brahman, we have been given the most incredible boon. Now victory is assured, thanks to the Charya Devata Guru. Chapter 52. The second Leela reflects upon the first Leela's own self-concept, life after death. Vashishta said, in the meanwhile, O Rama, the first Leela saw her husband lying unconscious before her and about to breathe his last. She spoke to Saraswati, behold, O mother, my husband is about to shuffle his mortal coil in this perilous war that has laid waste his whole kingdom. Saraswati replied, this combat that you saw, fought with such fury and lasting so long in the field, was neither fought in your kingdom nor in any part of this earth. It occurred nowhere except in the vacant space of the shrine containing the dead body of the Brahman, where it lived only as the phantom of a dream. This land that appeared as the kingdom of your living Lord Viduratha was situated with all its territories in the inner apartment of Padma. Again, it was the tomb of the Brahman Vasishta, situated in the hilly village of Vindhya, that showed these varying scenes of the mortal world within itself, as the departed soul views the vision of the past world within its narrow tomb. So is the appearance of all worldly accidents unreal in their nature. These objects that we see here as realities, including these bodies of mine and yours and this of Leela, together with this earth and these waters, are just the same as phantom, rising in the tomb of the deceased Brahman of the hilly region. It is the soul that presents the images of things, and nothing external which is wholly unreal can cast its reflections on the soul. Therefore, know your soul to be the true essence, which is uncreated and immortal, and the source of all creations within itself. The soul reflects on its inborn images without changing itself in any way. Therefore, it was the nature of the Brahman's soul that displayed these images in itself within the sphere of his tomb. But the illusion of the world, all its commotion, was viewed in the vacant space of the souls of the Brahman and Padma, and was not displayed in the empty space of their tombs, where there was no such false reflection of the world. There is no error or illusion anywhere, except in the misconception of the observer. Therefore, the removal of the fallacy from the mind of the viewer leads him to the perception of the light of truth. Well, this is a very important reminder that the whole of our 4 million lifetimes and the incarnation of all the different species of life that can exist in this world has been pure illusion. In verse 10, the soul reflects on its inborn images without changing itself in any way. It is the soul that presents the images of things and nothing external. What is the soul? It is the faint light originating in the absolute realm as Krishna's effulgence, Paramajyoti Shakti. And as it filters into the relative illusory world, like the light behind the movie film that projects the film on the screen of the theater, it is projecting the karmic traces, which are the film of existence. It's projecting those karmic traces on the screen of the mind. And we mistake it for a reality. We see it as real. But it is this light, Paramajyoti Shakti, Krishna's effulgence, the source of exactly who we are, the light that never ceases to illuminate, to be there in our awareness as the silent witness. That is calling us back to unity with Krishna. In this lifetime, we have all the proper configurations of our individual karmic traces to leave just enough of a gap so that this effulgence of Krishna is somehow illuminating the interior of our false reflection of the world. And by this illumination, it arises a sense of seeking after that light, which we sense to be the only reality, becomes the motivation for seeking Jivan Mukti. In verse 13, error consists in taking the unreal for the real. And in thinking the viewer and the view, or the subject and objective, is different from each other. This is how we engage in this error all the time. This is the purpose of the Yoga Vashishta. Purpose of the Yoga Vashishta is exactly summed up in this verse. It is the removal of the distinction of the subjective and objective that leads us to the knowledge of unity, the one or Om. Know that the Supreme Soul is free from the acts of production and destruction. This is Paramajyoti Shakti. And it is his light, the effulgence of Krishna, that displays all things of which he is the source. Learn that the outer nature has no existence nor change in itself. The souls of other beings exhibit their own nature in themselves, just like those in the burial tomb of the Brahman displayed the various dispositions to which his mind was accustomed. The soul has no notion of the outer world or any creating thing in it. Its consciousness of itself is like an uncreated emptiness. It comprehends its knowledge of the world in itself.